Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. We all think the world is external, that it is outside of us. Yet, it's really all inside of us. Our incongruent thoughts are the incongruent things that we see occurring in the world all around us. What has been an incongruent thought materialized in the real world? Well, it's Mark Zuckerberg's Metaverse. In the era of a global, a worldwide pandemic, where what we have all craved is that, if only limited, human interaction to remind us that we are not alone in this world, that there is something about this human bond that we all share and this physical presence around one another that we all need in order to grow and survive. Old Marky Boy, he introduces a brand new virtual world so that you can be isolated sitting in front of your computer like a dildo, waiting to provide and receive moments of pleasure. Also, we will explore the depths of disappointment, whether that be ours or the disappointment of others, and by way of example, we will use the University of Tennessee men's basketball team. And before I forget, which I routinely do, thank you all so much for listening to the podcast, for supporting what I do. It would be greatly appreciated if you could give this podcast a review, 5-star, thumbs up. If you could retweet it, if that's what one would do, or circulate it on the Facebook or the Instagram or the other social media platforms. Hit the thing or the forward thing or whatever the things are that the kids use to distribute the content around the internets. If you could do that as well, I'd greatly appreciate it. The podcast is also on Patreon. This is Why I Don't Vote podcast on Patreon. If you like what you hear and you want to continue hearing it, please support the podcast. Let us get underway.
Act 1. Does Mark Zuckerberg want us all to commit suicide?
For at least the last year, if not the last 18 months, all we've heard in popular culture, all we've heard out of the media, all we've heard from our neighbors, our coworkers, friends, family, anyone out in the Twitterverse, anyone on Facebook or Instagram, the desperation associated with isolation. We have become isolated from one another because of a worldwide pandemic. Yes, we can communicate virtually. Yes, we have phones, we have computers, we have tablets. We have these electronic mediums that we can use to communicate with one another, but we've lost that human touch. Parents lament the opportunity for their children to go and not only learn at school, but learn how to socialize with their contemporaries, with kids their age, with kids other ages, with their teachers. They are lamenting the fact that their children are missing this very important opportunity in their lives to learn how to socialize in a society. Many employees, many business people in many industries, they relish now the opportunity to work from home, to cut out a commute, to be closer to their family, but just as many now crave the opportunity to get out of the house, to get away from the family, to go and actually work among colleagues again, to work among contemporaries, to have that human contact that is often so important in solving problems, in coming up with ideas. We are social animals. We crave social interaction with other human beings. No matter how introverted we believe ourselves to be, even having a daily interaction with someone at a checkout counter, at a line, going outside and being able to go to a Starbucks and simply acquire a coffee, having the human interaction involved in such what appears to be a simple endeavor is an important, if not necessary, element of the human existence. Most all of us take this for granted, and in that way, COVID has been a lesson on how important physical human interaction is for all of us. Advertisers, for their part, never invest money into risky bets. Advertisers like safe bets. Advertisers want to reach as many people as possible to sell as much of their product as possible. And that's why you see so many advertisers pushing this narrative of, let's get back out among your fellow man. Let's take care of one another again. Let's look out for one another again. Let's get outside of our own introspective self and think about others. Now, sitting here with you, we both know, dear listener, advertisers do not care about any of the things that they purport to care about in their advertisements, right? They are looking for safe bets. They are looking to mirror the sentiment that we hold as a consuming public. They will feed it back to us. As long as they believe that narrative is safe, then they will follow it. I raise that point only to illustrate how clearly it appears that we as a collective human species, as a human race, all agree being isolated sucks. Being isolated is bad for us. Being isolated promotes regression and separation, not progression and integration. Now, I'm sure you've heard it. I know I have heard it, whether it's on the news, whether it's on some social media feed, perhaps it's in conversation with family or friends or work colleagues. The impact on mental health from this isolation has been severe, has been drastic. As bad as mental health was, particularly in the United States, but in Western society in general, as bad as it was prior to COVID, prior to the isolation, it has gotten infinitely worse during the isolation. Let's just speak plainly. People want to kill themselves. They want to commit suicide based on what? This sense of isolation that they had prior to COVID, and then the true physical isolation that they experienced during COVID. It drives people to want to end their lives. That is how significant isolation, being physically and mentally separated from your fellow man, that is how significant isolation can be on one's mental health, on the mental health of your community, on the mental health of the overall consciousness of the human race. Looking at the clock, I'm 5 minutes in, and I could go on and on about how this isolation has affected the collective consciousness. In the midst of a worldwide pandemic, in the midst of this hyper-realization, no matter what country you're in, no matter what race or religion or gender or age, we all come together in the midst of this pandemic and recognize how important human interaction, interpersonal human interaction is to our collective health, to our individual health. Mark Zuckerberg announces not only a change in the name of his company, turning all of this conglomerate of apps, of social media platforms, turning them all into one company called Meta. Mark Zuckerberg announces the Metaverse, a virtual reality where, and let's break this down, let's truly break this down, where you will sit in front of your computer and you will place on your head a headset. And you might actually even hold things in your hand. And you will live virtually in a universe created by Zuckerberg that mirrors the real world. You will do this alone. You will do this in the solitude of one room in what is likely for most of the people who are going to actually participate in this, some dungeon-like basement or some very small studio apartment. You will, for all intents and purposes, be entering into a virtual world of COVID. You will be electing, you will be self-selecting to enter a world that is not unlike the world that you lived in during COVID. I have looked at the popular culture reaction to this announcement, the Metaverse, and how people have batted it around. I have not yet heard anyone remark on the fact that the paradox is glaring. The paradox here is glaring, and it is sitting right in front of our faces. We have to look around the paradox to actually see past it. This is a virtual world that is not unlike the world we lived in during COVID. Now, dear listener, you may remark, well, you can put on funny pants, or you can dress up as an ogre, or you can go and fly and do things that you can't do in the real world. My response to you, dear listener, to anyone who would raise any point similar to this is, so what? So what? The pitch here is you can sit at home and go places that you otherwise never would have gone. That you can go and see things that you otherwise would have never seen. And what does that mean? They're all fake. They are all versions of a real place. What did the pandemic teach us? We need actual, physical, human interaction. We are physical beings. Now, I don't want to get into any metaphysical argument about the fact that in reality, we are spiritual beings in a physical body, but part of our physical experience is actually going out and experiencing things physically. Isolation and separation are not healthy for the human being. Something as simple as being able to go out and get a cup of coffee, or go and get a meal, or go and shop for something, or take a walk around a park. Something as simple as getting outside and seeing and interacting with other people is a necessary element to this human physical existence. COVID demonstrated as much. Even people who isolate, who feel like they have no real community, that don't interact well with other human beings, even in light of the pandemic, you'd think that they would be cherishing as much. No, they felt worse than they felt when they could go outside and didn't have the confidence that had some sort of social or mental barrier for doing so. They felt as bad or worse than anybody else did. Can you see the paradox, dear listener? It's not the metaverse. It's the COVID-verse. It is a self-selecting COVID-verse. So what if you can float? So what if you get to wear some funny pants and go to a place that you believe that you otherwise could not go? It is defeatist in and of itself to believe that there are places that you can't go or things that you can't see, and that you're going to have to settle for some virtual version of those things, isolating, separating, being alone, and having this virtual world be your only outlet. Two main points that I want to make, two things that came through me when I heard about this metaverse and looked into it. The first thing is, so many people want to get away from their reality. And I can't argue with this because I think every one of us has felt like that at some point in our lives. That we're frustrated with everything that's going on in our lives. We're frustrated with the people around us, with the things that are going on at work, or with our family, or with our social circle, religion, and we want to get away. It is such a popular thing amongst so many different types of people that an airline can use it as their slogan and come from a small commuter airline in the state of Texas to a nationwide airline. Southwest Airlines want to get away. But let's look at that from below and not from above. From above, we're judging. From below, let's look at our own reality. How many of us really know well all of our neighbors? How many of us really know well everything about our surroundings? Everybody at work, everybody who works around us, the other businesses around us at work. How many of us know well all of the parishioners that go to the church that we go to, or everyone that goes to a certain bar or restaurant that we like? What came through me, because I am as much a perpetrator of this as anyone else, I don't need an escape from my reality. I need to escape into my reality. I need to embrace my reality. I need to get my head out of my ass and stop being so concerned with my own petty thoughts, my own petty concerns, and actually go out and talk to some of the people that I see on a day-to-day basis. And this is mirrored in Judeo-Christian values and traditions. It is mirrored in all of these self-help or self-improvement seminars and books, the literature, the movement. Science mirrors it. Scientific studies support it. Get out of your own head. Be less concerned with you and be more concerned with others. And it doesn't have to be something so complicated as volunteering your time or going out and trying to find a cause to support. It can be something as simple as asking people how they're doing, asking people about their interests, taking for 30 or 40 seconds a day the time to ask somebody about themselves. We don't do that. I personally, for years, did not do that. I challenge you, dear listener, to start doing that. And not only to start doing that, but to take a measure of people's reaction to you when you do that. I was in an elevator. There were probably 7 or 8 people in that elevator with me. Not one of them could have been older than 30. And I began to talk to them in the elevator. And it looked as if I had shit in the elevator in their presence, and then they all looked at me in amazement. It was unfathomable to them that I was engaging them in conversation, and not only that, asking them questions, asking them to get outside of their own heads and engage me as well. One, dear listener, one person responded to me. The rest sat silently to the extent that they would even look at me after I opened my mouth, and they were all looking down at what? If they had their phones out, they were looking at their phones, and if they didn't have their phones out, they were looking down at their feet. And that brings me to the second point that came through me when I heard about this metaverse. Our phones, our tablets, our computers are nothing more at this point in our lives, at this point in our evolution as human beings, than sadness devices. This is where we go to get sad. Now, we don't start sad. We might start in another emotion, but we work towards sadness. We never reach for our phones anymore to make ourselves happy. We may reach for our phone to make ourselves angry. We may reach for our phone to make ourselves indignant. We may reach for our phone to make ourselves jealous or envious. We may reach for our phones to make ourselves petty. But we never reach for our phones to make ourselves happy. Your phone, your tablet, your computer, it is at this point a sadness device. You're either doing one of two things. You're working, or you're scrolling on social media, or you're scrolling on some sports site, home and garden. You're scrolling. There is no happiness to be gleaned in scrolling. We are now communicating all of the things that we should be communicating to one another in an interpersonal forum. we are communicating these things via these devices. And we're doing so in a way that it's often that the recipient of the message is not getting the message the way that you intended it to be sent. How often have you been texting one or a group of people and your text was misinterpreted by the recipient, if not all the recipients, and you had to go and clarify what you were saying? People are doing that in a public square. People are doing that on the internet in these social media capacities, whether or not it's on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, whether or not it's a comment on an article that they've seen, whether or not it's commenting on clothes or a car. No matter what it is, people are writing out their thoughts. And it is often that they cannot articulate themselves well enough, or that because the written word does not contain any subtleties, no inflection, no tone of voice, people misinterpret what's being said. And when you misinterpret something, what is your first default setting? That person who I have interpreted, this person meant to say what I think that they said intentionally, and they did so to piss me off. Why would you want to elect to go into that type of world? Social media sites are bad enough. They have hurt interpersonal communication well enough. Why would you want to volunteer to go into that type of universe, staying away by the very nature of that virtual world from other human beings, and connect with them only via that format, via that forum? The paradox slaps me in the face. Pundit after pundit sees the metaverse as the future. This is where things are going. If you have any derision, if you have any doubts, you're just an old man. You don't see the future. Separation is never the solution. Separation is only going to create a further sense of isolation and is only going to create this despair amongst us all. Are we so insecure with who we are that the only way that we could speak to somebody else is through a virtual persona? Are we so insecure about other people that the only way we feel we can trust them is to approach them via a virtual persona? If this is the future, dear listener, I ask you, does Mark Zuckerberg want us all to commit suicide?
Act 2, The Art of Disappointment, a Rick Barnes story.
On this very podcast last season, I admitted that I was not happy about the hiring of Rick Barnes at the University of Tennessee when it happened. Rick Barnes was fired by the University of Texas. He had taken a number of very talented teams to the NCAA tournament with little success to show for it, given his close to 2-decade tenure at the school. Barnes, being an older man, I wondered whether or not he was going to have the zeal to recruit, to compete with the likes of the University of Kentucky. Is he going to want to go to a school where, for all intents and purposes, it's a rebuilding project? Well, Barnes was hired, he took the reins, and lo and behold, the University of Tennessee has become a competent basketball program again. Mea culpa, I didn't see it coming. I admitted as much in the podcast last season. The other reason why I wasn't excited about the Rick Barnes hire, and again, which I expressed on this very podcast, was his lack of success in the NCAA tournament. That, unfortunately, dear listener, has persisted in his stead as head coach of the University of Tennessee. In the year of our Lord, 2022, the University of Tennessee basketball team went undefeated at home, won the SEC tournament, or the SEC tournament champions, and were bounced out by a Michigan team that, in my humble opinion, should not have even made the NCAA field. Although I have not done a segment on the NCAA tournament this season, I drink the Kool-Aid. I drink it down without questioning. I picked the University of Tennessee to win the NCAA championship in not one, but two different pools. Note, I live in the state of Arizona. Tennessee was in the same bracket as Arizona. Tennessee had beaten Arizona earlier this year. I knew that if Tennessee went to the Final Four, beating the University of Arizona, I would be way ahead in those brackets because practically everybody in this state has Arizona going to the national championship, if not winning the national championship. Tennessee bounced out by Michigan, an 11 seed, in the second round. Rick Barnes now in 51 games. 51 games. You have to be not a competent, not a capable, but a great coach to coach in 51 NCAA tournament games. In 51 NCAA tournament games, Rick Barnes' record is 25-26. He has a sub 500 record. There is a paradox that lies within that very record. He is good enough to coach up a number of different teams to the point where they make the tournament, and yet he has some block, some impediment. He can't get these teams to go far in the tournament. So he's taken teams over the course of a number of years to the tournament, and they lose. Well, you may be asking, maybe he just made the NCAA tournament with these teams by the skin of his teeth, so to speak. He barely got in. They were all higher seeds. It was an improbable selection. The odds were against the team, and it only makes sense from a statistical standpoint that being a higher seed, he would have a sub 500 or a 500 record. No, dear listener, and many of you being sports fans know this to be true, at the University of Texas in particular, at the University of Tennessee, he had very good basketball teams that often had very good seeding, meaning that they were placed against teams that were from smaller conferences, that had made the field by, again, using that colloquialism, the skin of their teeth. The University of Michigan is one of those teams, the team that beat the University of Tennessee in the NCAA tournament this year. That was a team, again, I did not think that they should have gotten an at-large bid in the first place, much less not have to play in one of the play-in games to get their seat. I can honestly say that I am not that disappointed. And that is what I want to discuss in this segment of the podcast, disappointment. Rick Barnes, in my mind, is now the Marty Schottenheimer of men's college basketball. He is a great coach. He is going to be able to take teams that have underachieved for a significant period of time. He is going to be able to coach them up so that they can overachieve, but he has this blockage. He has this impediment. He can't win when it counts the most. He can't win in the postseason. Am I being negative? Am I being pessimistic? Or am I just accepting the reality of the situation? And this is what I wrestled with after Tennessee lost to the University of Michigan. I didn't have the kind of teeth-gnashing, foot-stomping disappointment that I'd had in the past over the University of Tennessee football team or basketball team, losing a game that I was convinced they should have won. Harken back to the segment I did on the Toronto Maple Leafs being bounced out of the NHL playoffs last year, and my final thought was, I'm not giving this team I'm not giving this organization any more credit for success until I see them playing in the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs. The history is too daunting. So although I had such high expectations, when those expectations were not met, I didn't really suffer that much in the way of disappointment. Why? Why did I no longer have the kind of disappointment that I had in years past? And I believe that in the last podcast episode discussing the Dan Snyder-led Washington football team, one JB made a comment that he was no longer as attached to the team. The team is on. It's a Sunday afternoon. Are you glued to the TV sitting on the couch? No. You've got it on in the background. You certainly have your attention diverted if it's the third or the fourth quarter and the game is close. But you are no longer as attached to the team, as attached to the outcome as you were as a younger man. And herein lies the paradox. I mourn for the fan in me that is no longer that voracious, that enthusiastic. Ignorance is surely bliss, and I am no longer ignorant. It is difficult to continue to have the level of attachment when not only are you becoming more wise to the way that sports operates in general, but in particular, that these individual franchises are so poorly run, are so poorly managed, are so poorly operated, they have so little success over a period of time. It is the death of the fan in me, and my ego mourns the loss of that self. As I stated on the podcast last week, when talking to my close friends who still have a very passionate self, a very passionate part of their ego following these sports teams, I felt like an alcoholic in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting being convinced you need to take a drink. The paradox is that the other parts of my ego, my other selves, celebrate the death of my fandom. Those parts of myself have been liberated to go out and do so many different things instead of being tied to a television set or even spending the money to go to a live sporting event. The attachment is no longer to the outcome of the sporting event for Team A or Team B. It's just the enjoyment of going to the event. The attachment isn't to the outcome of what's happening on the moving picture box. It's simply whether or not I'm enjoying watching the moving picture box in that moment. At the beginning of this very podcast, where I began to elucidate why I'm actually doing this, part of my rationale was, as a fan, I was questioning my own fandom, my own loyalty to certain franchises, to certain sports, in light of my enlightenment, my, better said, lack of ignorance. Is my passion being appropriately applied to the things I'm passionate about? Am I applying too much energy to things that, by way of what they give me back, they don't warrant that much energy? They take more than they give. One of the things that came through me, and I actually laughed about it because I think it is somewhat of a humorous joke, but I'm not so sure that it isn't true in its foundation, is that the Lord has a sense of humor and was playing the long game with me. You want to marry these tragic franchises? So be it. You'll come back to the realization that there's so much more in this spectacular world of ours that you can enjoy, that you can create, And you'll come to that conclusion by getting repeatedly kicked in the balls, giving your fealty to these terrible sports franchises. And it's happened. The highs aren't that high anymore, but the lows aren't that low. Perhaps this is what it is to achieve balance. I'm taking it all very seriously, but not too seriously. A final thought on Rick Barnes. My initial reaction to his post-game press conference, which I only watched a little bit of, and to be fair, I only watched it on the YouTube well after he had given it, to see some of the comments that he made in the days after the loss to Michigan, I actually felt a significant amount of compassion and empathy for the man. He's not out on the court. He hurts for these kids who went out onto the court and shot 2 for 18 from three-point range, who clearly had in their heads this cold streak with the basketball and looked afraid to shoot it for a significant part of the second half. A man who likely felt the pain of these kids being out on the floor and not even being able to make a layup, being in that kind of dysregulated state on the basketball court. I didn't hurt as much for Rick Barnes and his terrible NCAA record as I did for someone who was clearly hurting for the players that he loves and seeing how much it hurt them to fail in that manner against a team that I think they all felt that they were much better than, that they underperformed against, and that they should have beat. Disappointment is truly only real when you have not only an attachment to the outcome, but you have placed such an expectation to that attachment. Extremely high hopes. And then you get not only the disappointment from having those high hopes, then seeing them dashed with an outcome that you could not conceive in the energy of that expectation. Through a Zen or a Buddhist lens, you have removed yourself from this attachment, and you can channel better some of the higher parts of yourself. I didn't have the same level of attachment. I did have expectation, I will admit that, and that's why I had some disappointment, but I didn't have the level of attachment. Therefore, I looked at the situation with Rick Barnes, and I thought to myself, he's got to be really hurting. I can feel his hurt and disappointment, not only for himself, but moreover, for these kids. He thought that this was the type of team, given everything that they've gone through and everything that they've accomplished, winning the SEC championship for the first time since 1979, he thought this was a team that could go on and win a national championship. And like many of his other teams, snake-bitten in the NCAA tournament by a team that was their inferior 364 days out of the year, and yet on that one day, all the expectations dashed. Where will the fan in me be next season? I'm sure in front of the television set, watching those Tennessee-Kentucky games and passionately, fervently rooting against the University of Kentucky in favor of my Tennessee Volunteers. When Tennessee loses one of those games, will I gnash my teeth? Will I stomp my feet? I do feel separation, dear listener, and it is separation from my expectations, from my attachment to the outcome, from the part of myself that calls itself a fan. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.